The wind howled across the desolate plains of Arizona Territory in 1847, carrying with it the acrid scent of smoke and the bitter taste of betrayal. Sarah Mitchell pressed her trembling hands against the rough wooden walls of the abandoned trading post, her once pristine calico dress now torn and stained with dust and tears. 3 days had passed since the people of Willowbrook had driven her out, their faces twisted with disgust and righteous fury. 3 days since they had branded her a traitor to her own kind. What they didn't know was that their judgment would soon prove to be the least of their worries. The real danger was already moving across the desert, and only Sarah held the key to their survival. But first, she would have to survive herself. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Sarah's blood freeze. Through the gaps in the weathered planks, she could see riders emerging from the heat shimmer like phantoms materialized from her worst nightmares. Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons glinting in the merciless sun. She had heard the stories whispered around campfires, tales of entire settlements reduced to ash and bone. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the riders drew closer, and she realized with dawning horror that there was nowhere left to run. The trading post offered no real shelter, its walls as brittle as her hope. Death, it seemed, had finally come to collect what the desert had been promising for days. But as the lead warrior dismounted and approached the trading post, something unexpected happened. Instead of the war cry she expected, instead of the flash of steel that would end her misery, a voice spoke in accented but clear English. It was a woman's voice, strong and sure, cutting through the desert silence like a blade through silk. The words that followed would change everything Sarah thought she knew about enemies and allies, about survival and sacrifice. They were words that would haunt her dreams and reshape her understanding of the world she thought she knew. The Apache warrior who stepped into the dim interior of the trading post was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. She was tall and lean, her movements fluid as water, her dark eyes holding depths that spoke of wisdom earned through countless trials. War paint streaked her bronze skin in patterns that told stories Sarah couldn't read, and her black hair hung in intricate braids adorned with feathers and small bones. But it was her eyes that held Sarah captive. They were not the eyes of a savage killer, as the settlers had always claimed. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, suffered too much, and understood the weight of difficult choices. The warrior's name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her people's tongue, though she had not felt like blooming for many seasons. She had been tracking the small party of Apache raiders who had been terrorizing settlements across the territory, following a trail that had led her here to this forgotten outpost. What she had not expected to find was a white woman alone and clearly abandoned, her pale skin burned by the sun and her eyes hollow with desperation. Something about the woman's situation stirred memories Ayanna had tried to bury, memories of her own exile and the price of standing against one's own people. Sarah's voice cracked when she finally found the courage to speak. She told Ayanna about Willowbrook, about the terrible discovery that had led to her banishment. She had caught her husband, Thomas, selling weapons to Apache raiders in exchange for information about other settlements. The very weapons that had been used to slaughter innocent families were being provided by a man she had loved and trusted. When she confronted him, when she threatened to expose his treachery to the town council, he had turned the tables on her with devastating efficiency. He claimed she was the traitor, that he had discovered her secret correspondence with Apache warriors. The evidence he presented was fabricated but convincing, and the townspeople had been only too eager to believe the worst about the woman who had always been too independent, too willing to question their harsh judgments about the native peoples. Ayanna listened to Sarah's story with growing understanding, recognizing the familiar pain of being cast out by one's own tribe. Her own exile had come years earlier, when she had refused to participate in a raid against a peaceful Mormon settlement. Her people had branded her a coward and a traitor, forcing her to live as an outcast in the spaces between worlds. She had spent years trying to find her way back to belonging somewhere, anywhere, but the path had been long and lonely. Now, looking at this broken white woman, she saw an opportunity for something she had almost forgotten existed: redemption. Not just for Sarah, but perhaps for herself as well. The truth that Ayanna revealed next would shatter everything Sarah thought she understood about the recent attacks. Thomas Mitchell was not working alone. He was part of a larger conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, a network of corrupt officials and unscrupulous traders who were deliberately stirring up conflict between settlers and Apache tribes. Their goal was to provoke a war that would justify military intervention, opening up vast tracts of Apache land for mining and railroad development. The attacks on settlements were being orchestrated to appear random and savage, when in reality they were carefully planned operations designed to maximize fear and outcry for government action. But there was more, and it was worse than Sarah could have imagined. The next target was not a small settlement or an isolated ranch. It was Fort Defiance itself, the primary military outpost in the region. Thomas and his conspirators had been feeding information to a rogue band of Apache warriors, telling them exactly when the fort would be most vulnerable. They had convinced these warriors that a successful attack on the fort would drive the white soldiers from Apache lands forever, when in truth it would provide the perfect pretext for a massive military campaign that would destroy the Apache way of life once and for all. The attack was planned for 3 days hence, when most of the fort's garrison would be away on patrol, leaving only a skeleton crew to defend against what would appear to be an overwhelming surprise assault. Iana's people faced annihilation either way. If the attack succeeded, the military retaliation would be swift and merciless. If it failed, the warriors involved would be hunted down and killed, but the damage would already be done. The conspiracy required Apache blood to be spilled, whether as victors or victims mattered little to men like Thomas Mitchell. They needed their war, and they were willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone to get it. Sarah realized with growing horror that her husband had been manipulating events from the very beginning, probably even orchestrating their move to Willowbrook to be in position for his part in this grand deception. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson, and Iana made Sarah an offer that would change both their lives forever. Together, they could stop this conspiracy before it destroyed countless innocent lives on both sides. But it would require Sarah to do something that terrified her more than facing down a war party alone. She would have to return to Willowbrook, to the people who had cast her out in shame, and convince them to listen to the truth. More than that, she would have to do it with an Apache warrior at her side, trusting that their shared purpose would be stronger than generations of hatred and misunderstanding. The journey back to Willowbrook took 2 days of hard riding across terrain that seemed designed to break both horses and spirits. Iana proved to be a skilled guide, finding water where Sarah saw only rock and leading them through passages that avoided the main trails where Thomas's associates might be watching. As they traveled, the two women shared stories of their lives before exile, finding unexpected common ground in their love of family, their respect for the land, and their frustration with the rigid expectations placed upon them by their respective communities. Sarah learned that Iana had once been married to a war chief's son, but had lost both husband and child in a cavalry attack years earlier. The grief had nearly broken her, but it had also freed her from the traditional constraints that might have prevented her from acting independently now. They arrived at Willowbrook as the church bells were calling people to Sunday service, a timing that Iana insisted was no coincidence. If they were going to convince the townspeople to listen, they needed them all in one place, and more importantly, they needed them to be reminded of their Christian duty to seek truth and justice. The plan was audacious and dangerous. Sarah would enter the church alone, interrupt the service, and demand a hearing based on new evidence she had uncovered. If she could hold their attention long enough, Iana would join her, and together they would present the proof of Thomas's treachery and the larger conspiracy threatening them all. The reaction when Sarah walked through those church doors was everything she had feared and more. Gasps of shock rippled through the congregation, followed quickly by angry muttering and calls for her immediate removal. Pastor Williams tried to maintain order, but his own face showed the strain of seeing the woman he had personally helped cast out now standing defiantly in his sanctuary. Thomas sat in the front pew with his new bride, a young woman from the neighboring town of Cedar Creek, and his face went white as bleached bone when he saw his former wife. He began to rise, perhaps to call for the sheriff, but Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with surprising strength and authority. She spoke of evidence hidden in Thomas's private papers, of meetings held in secret with men whose names would shock the congregation if they knew. She told them about weapons shipments and carefully orchestrated attacks, about Apache warriors being manipulated just as thoroughly as the white settlers they attacked. Most importantly, she told them about Fort Defiance and the catastrophe that would unfold if they did not act immediately. The congregation listened with growing unease, not wanting to believe but finding her words too detailed and specific to dismiss as the ravings of a bitter woman. It was then that Ayanna made her entrance, moving through the church doors with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death so many times that the disapproval of strangers held no terror. The congregation's reaction was explosive. Men reached for weapons that weren't there, women pulled children close, and several people moved toward the windows as if planning to flee. But Pastor Williams, to his credit, raised his hand for silence and asked Ayanna to speak her piece. What followed was a revelation that none of them had expected. Ayanna did not speak as a savage or an enemy. She spoke as a daughter of the land who had watched her people suffer under the manipulation of corrupt white men who cared nothing for Apache or settler alike. She detailed the specific weapons that had been sold to the raiders, weapons that had come from the Willowbrook General Store with Thomas's full knowledge and participation. She described the coded messages and the payment system, all information that she could only have known if she had been watching Thomas's activities for months. Most damning of all, she produced physical evidence, documents and artifacts that Thomas had thought were safely hidden, but which Ayanna had retrieved during her surveillance of his secret meetings. Thomas could remain silent no longer. He leaped to his feet and began shouting accusations at both women, calling them liars and conspirators who had obviously planned this deception together. He reminded the congregation of Sarah's alleged treachery, of the evidence that had convinced them to banish her in the first place. But his words had a desperate quality now, the sound of a man who felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Ayanna listened to his protests with the patient expression of someone who had expected exactly this reaction, and when he finally ran out of accusations, she quietly began to dismantle his lies piece by methodical piece. The forged evidence that had convinced the townspeople of Sarah's guilt had been cleverly done, but Ayanna had learned much about the white man's writing during her years of exile. She pointed out inconsistencies in the handwriting, differences in paper and ink that revealed the documents had been created at different times and places than claimed. More importantly, she had brought with her the real correspondence between Thomas and his Apache contacts, letters that proved beyond doubt who the true traitor had always been. The congregation sat in stunned silence as the scope of the deception became clear, their righteous certainty crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. But Thomas had one final card to play, and it was a devastating one. With the smooth confidence of a man who had been planning for this possibility all along, he revealed that the attack on Fort Defiance had already begun. While everyone had been focused on the drama unfolding in the church, his confederates had been moving forward with their plan. Even if the townspeople now believed Sarah and Ayanna, even if they recognized Thomas's guilt, it was already too late to prevent the catastrophe that would justify the war his sponsors so desperately wanted. The Apache warriors who had been manipulated into the attack were probably already dead, cut down by the defensive preparations that Thomas had secretly helped arrange. The silence that followed this revelation was broken by the sound of distant gunfire carried on the desert wind. Fort Defiance was indeed under attack, and from the sound of it, the battle was fierce and desperate. Thomas smiled with ugly satisfaction as he told them that whether the fort fell or held, the result would be the same. Dead Apache warriors would provide the perfect justification for the military campaign that would open their lands to mining and development, while any settlers killed in the attack would be martyrs to the cause of civilization triumphing over savagery. He had played everyone perfectly, Apache and settler alike, and now he would reap the rewards of his long planning. Ayanna's role in exposing the conspiracy made her something of a celebrity as well, though she was less comfortable with the attention than Sarah seemed to be. Newspaper reporters wanted to interview the Apache warrior who had risked everything to prevent a war that would have devastated her own people as much as the white settlers. Government officials wanted to consult with her about Apache customs and perspectives that they had never bothered to understand. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to claim her as an example of what could be accomplished when different peoples worked together in good faith. But Ayanna's greatest satisfaction came from a more personal source. Her actions in exposing the conspiracy and preventing the war had earned her a path back to acceptance within Apache society, though not in the way she had originally expected. The chiefs who had worked with her to stop the attack on Fort Defiance recognized that her years of exile had given her knowledge and perspectives that could benefit all Apache people as they faced an uncertain future. Rather than simply welcoming her back into her original band, they offered her a new role as a liaison between Apache communities and the white authorities, a position that would make use of her unique understanding of both worlds. Sarah faced her own choices about the future, choices that were both easier and more difficult than Ayana's. The revelation of Thomas's guilt had cleared her name and opened the door for her return to Willowbrook society. But she found herself questioning whether she wanted that return. The experience of exile had shown her aspects of herself that she had never known existed, strengths and capabilities that the restrictive expectations of settlement life had never allowed her to explore. The woman who had been cast out in shame was not the same woman who now stood vindicated before her former community. The friendship that had developed between Sarah and Ayana during their desperate mission together had deepened into something that neither woman had words to describe adequately. They had saved each other in ways that went far beyond the immediate crisis they had faced together. Sarah had given Ayana a chance to find meaning and purpose in her exile, while Ayana had shown Sarah that survival was possible even when everything familiar and comfortable had been stripped away. They had become each other's proof that redemption was possible and that the future could be different from the past. The final resolution of the conspiracy's aftermath took months to work through the legal and political systems, but the essential facts were never in dispute. Thomas Mitchell and his principal confederates were convicted of treason and conspiracy, receiving sentences that effectively ended their lives as free men. More importantly, the exposure of their manipulation led to significant changes in territorial policy toward Apache communities, changes that emphasized negotiation and mutual respect rather than the previous assumptions of inevitable conflict. It was not a perfect solution to centuries of misunderstanding and injustice, but it represented a genuine step toward a different kind of future. On a warm spring evening nearly a year after the events at Fort Defiance, Sarah and Ayana sat together on the porch of the small ranch house that Sarah had built on land midway between Willowbrook and the Apache settlements. It was a symbolic location as much as a practical one, representing her choice to live in the space between worlds rather than fully belonging to either. Ayana had become a frequent visitor, sometimes staying for weeks at a time as her liaison duties brought her into contact with territorial officials and military commanders who were slowly learning to see Apache people as potential partners rather than inevitable enemies. The sun was setting over the desert landscape that had nearly been their grave, painting the sky in shades that seemed to promise endless possibilities. They had both learned that safety was not something that could be guaranteed or provided by others, but rather something that had to be created through courage, truth, and the willingness to stand with those who shared your values regardless of the risks involved. The Apache warriors' promise that had begun their unlikely partnership had proven to be more than mere words. In saving each other, they had discovered that true safety lay not in the protection of walls or weapons, but in the bonds forged between people who had chosen to trust despite every reason for suspicion. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, both women understood that their story was far from over. The territory was changing, the relationship between Apache and settler communities was evolving, and their own roles in shaping that future remained to be written. But they faced whatever was coming with the confidence of people who had already survived the worst that fear and hatred could inflict, and who had found in each other the strength to build something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The desert winds that had once carried only the threat of death now whispered promises of redemption, renewal, and the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with patience, courage, and love. The seasons turned as they always had in the Arizona territory, but the land itself seemed to hold its breath differently now, as if the very desert remembered the moment when war had been averted by two women who refused to accept that hatred was the only option. Sarah's ranch had become something neither she nor Ayana had originally envisioned, a meeting place where Apache families and white settlers could encounter each other as people rather than enemies, where children from both communities could play together while their parents learned to see past generations of fear and mistrust. The small adobe house had grown over the months, expanded with rooms for visitors and a large common area where difficult conversations could take place in safety. Sarah had discovered that she possessed a natural gift for mediation, an ability to help people find common ground even when their starting positions seemed impossibly far apart. Her own experience of exile and redemption had given her a deep understanding of how quickly certainties could crumble, and how essential it was to remain open to changing one's mind when presented with new evidence. Ayana's work as a liaison had evolved as well, expanding beyond simple translation and communication to become a genuine bridge between cultures that had been suspicious of each other for generations. She had established a network of relationships that stretched across the territory, connecting Apache bands with sympathetic settlers, progressive military officers, and even some territorial officials who had genuinely learned from the conspiracy's exposure. Her greatest achievement had been the creation of a formal council that included representatives from all the major communities in the region, a body that met regularly to address conflicts before they could escalate into violence. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they were expecting visitors who would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Major Harrison, now promoted to colonel and assigned to implement the new policies of cooperation rather than conquest, was coming with his family to share a meal with Apache Chief White Eagle and his extended family. It was the kind of gathering that had once existed only in the dreams of a few visionaries, now made real through the patient work of building trust one conversation at a time. The children arrived first, as children always do, racing ahead of their parents with the boundless energy of youth unencumbered by adult prejudices. Apache and white children mixed together naturally, their laughter echoing across the desert as they played games that borrowed elements from both cultures. Sarah watched them from her kitchen window and smiled, knowing that these children would grow up with assumptions very different from those that had nearly destroyed their parents' generation. They would face their own challenges, certainly, but they would do so with the knowledge that cooperation was possible, and that differences in culture and appearance need not be barriers to friendship and understanding. As the adults gathered on the expanded porch that now wrapped around 3 sides of the house, the conversation flowed easily between English and Apache, with Ayana serving as translator when necessary but more often simply as a participant in discussions that ranged from practical matters of water rights and grazing permissions to deeper questions about how to preserve what was valuable in each culture while adapting to the realities of a changing world. These were not easy conversations, and they sometimes grew heated, but they were conversations that were happening at all, which represented a victory that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days when conspiracy and manipulation had nearly triggered a devastating war. Colonel Harrison's wife, Margaret, had become particularly close to Sarah over the months, finding in her a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to challenge conventional expectations about what women could and should do. Margaret had begun teaching school at the Apache settlement closest to the fort, while several Apache women had started attending Sarah's informal gatherings where they shared traditional knowledge about desert plants and healing techniques with settler women who were eager to learn skills that could help their families survive in this harsh but beautiful land. Chief White Eagle, an elderly man whose weathered face spoke of decades of difficult decisions and hard-won wisdom, had become something of a grandfather figure to Sarah, offering advice and perspective that helped her navigate the complex relationships required to maintain peace between communities that still harbored deep suspicions about each other's motives. He had lost 2 sons to cavalry attacks in the years before the conspiracy's exposure, yet he had chosen to work for peace rather than revenge, understanding that the cycle of violence would ultimately destroy everyone he cared about if it were allowed to continue. As the evening deepened and the desert air began to cool, the conversation turned to plans for the future. There was talk of establishing a permanent school that would serve children from all the local communities, taught by teachers who understood both Apache and settler cultures. Colonel Harrison spoke of new military policies that emphasized protection of all territorial residents, rather than the enforcement of one group's dominance over others. Chief White Eagle described young Apache men and women who were learning English and territorial law so they could represent their people's interests in the evolving political structure. But perhaps the most significant development was one that had grown so naturally from their friendship that neither Sarah nor Ayana had fully recognized its importance until others began to comment on it. They had become a living example of what was possible when people chose trust over fear, cooperation over competition. Their partnership had inspired others throughout the territory, leading to similar collaborations between individuals who might never have spoken to each other under the old assumptions about inevitable conflict between different peoples. The Apache name that had been given to Sarah during a ceremony the previous spring meant Bridgewalker, recognizing her role in connecting worlds that had seemed impossibly separate. She wore the beaded necklace that had accompanied the naming with quiet pride, understanding that it represented not just her own transformation, but the possibility of transformation for an entire region. Ayana's Apache name had evolved as well, from Eternal Blossom to Wisdom Bringer, acknowledging her unique ability to help people see beyond their immediate circumstances to envision different possibilities for the future. As the guests began to prepare for their journey home under a sky brilliant with stars, Sarah and Ayana stood together in comfortable silence, watching the children reluctantly separate from their games and the adults exchange final words about next week's council meeting. The desert night was peaceful in a way that felt earned rather than given, the result of countless small acts of courage and trust that had gradually built something stronger than the fear and hatred that had once seemed so natural and inevitable. The promise that Ayana had made during those desperate hours in the abandoned trading post had proven to be prophetic in ways neither woman could have anticipated. Safety had indeed been found, but not in the form of protection from danger. Instead, they had discovered that true safety lay in the creation of communities where different people could coexist with dignity and mutual respect. They had learned that the greatest security came not from walls or weapons, but from the knowledge that their neighbors saw them as fellow human beings deserving of consideration and care. The final image that would linger in memory was of two women who had found each other across a divide that was supposed to be unbridgeable, who had chosen to trust when everything in their experience told them that trust was dangerous, and who had discovered in that choice the seeds of a future that neither could have imagined when they first spoke those fateful words in the desert. The Apache warrior's promise had been kept, but it had become something larger than either protection or rescue. It had become the foundation for a new kind of community, one that honored the past while refusing to be imprisoned by it, and that faced an uncertain future with the confidence that comes from knowing that redemption is always possible when people choose courage over fear and love over hatred. In the end, they were all safe now, not because the world had become less dangerous, but because they had learned to create safety together through the ancient and revolutionary practice of treating each other as family.